Hello, my name is Isolde Driscoll, and you're very welcome to the Hugh Lane Gallery's series of online talks. Today, as part of the Coffee Conversation series, I'm going to be discussing this painting. It's called A Stormy Day Brighton, and it's part of the Lane Legacy exhibition that's currently on show in the gallery. The artist's name is Charles Conder, and he was active at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries, and he was a well-known figure in both Paris and London. Now, before I start talking about the painting, I'm just going to minimize my video panel so as not to distract us from the paintings, and then we can begin. Now, I first want to tell you about Charles Conder himself and his work more generally. Not only was he a significant and highly thought of painter in London and Paris, but he also played a very important role in the development of Australia's first distinct modern art style. This eventually became known as the Heidelberg School, and it's also sometimes referred to as Australian Impressionism. Here's a photograph of Charles Conder taken when he was at the height of his powers, along with his dates. And as you can see, he was actually quite young when he died. He was just 40. Now, I think that Charles Conder is a painter who demonstrates the impact of shifts in fashion on artistic reputations over time. And his career shows how an artist can fall out of favour, often simply because of a change in tastes, rather than anything to do with his specific talents. He was very highly regarded, and not just in London, but also in Paris, which at the end of the 19th century was at the very centre of the whole artistic avant-garde. He was heavily involved in the world of artists and writers, and was close friends with some of the major figures of the avant-garde. His work was admired by leading Impressionist painters such as Degas and Pissarro, and he was closely associated with other well-known modern painters such as William Rothenstein. He was also a follower of Whistler, and he showed his work very successfully at major exhibitions in both London and Paris at the turn of the century, and was seen as a significant modern painter at the time. Yet, despite all this, nowadays he's really best known for his contribution to the development of art in Australia. First, I'll give you some background. Charles Conder was born in London in 1868, and when he was 2, his family moved to India, where his father was employed as a railway engineer. His mother died there when he was 5, and when his father remarried 2 years later, he and his brother were sent back to school in England. Now, it seems that he had wanted to become an artist from a very early age. However, his father was vehemently opposed to this idea, and instead, in 1884, when he was 15, Charles was sent to an uncle living in Australia to train as a land surveyor. So Conder began his career in Australia, travelling out into the bush and camping there, learning how to survey the land. Now, unfortunately, he wasn't very good at it. It seems he was more interested in drawing the landscape than in surveying it. He only lasted about 18 months and spent most of that time sketching his surroundings. He then got a job in Sydney, first as an apprentice to a lithographer, and then as an illustrator in a local newspaper. And it was here, finally, that he was at last able to pursue his ambition to become an artist. He joined the Art Society of New South Wales, and he took art classes there. And as a result, he came into contact with other artists and began to paint with them, and to experiment with new techniques that were only just now starting to filter into Australia from Europe. Significantly, Australian artists were beginning to return from abroad with ideas that they had picked up in London and Paris, and to distribute them in Australia. And the most significant and potent of these new ideas in the Australian context was the concept of open air, or plein air painting. It was this idea that you would go out into the landscape and paint directly from nature what you saw in front of you, the ordinary landscape that was around you, the landscape that you found yourself in. And the dramatic, wide open, empty spaces in Australia at that time provided spectacular opportunities for doing this. In Sydney, Conder met another artist who he became friends with called Tom Roberts, who had recently returned to Australia from Europe. Roberts had attended the Royal Academy schools in London and then travelled to Paris and elsewhere in Europe, learning about new ideas such as Impressionism and aestheticism. And the two friends used to travel around the outskirts of Sydney and paint the local landscape there, including the beaches, which were at that time becoming important recreational spots for city dwellers. Now, Conder particularly enjoyed painting beachscapes, such as this one of Bronte Beach. You see it, it's called Bronte Beach, the Queen's Birthday. And you can see it here with its white sands and its blue sea and sky and its sunny, bright, golden atmosphere. Now, as we'll see, Conder would return to this kind of scene later on. In 1888, Roberts moved to Melbourne, and he persuaded Conder to join him there. Now, before he left, however, Conder did this painting in Sydney, called The Departure of the Orient Circular Quay. Now, he apparently painted this from an upstairs room on the quay at the harbour in Sydney. And when he finished it, he immediately sold it to the Gallery of New South Wales. So this painting is effectively his public artistic debut. And it incorporates themes and techniques that he would return to again. It's essentially an exercise in colour harmonies, and you can see this. You can see its silvery grey tones, and these are then offset by brighter patches of colour here and there, red patches, and then one or two brilliant patches of blue. And as well, he's sketched in the figures on the quay almost like a pattern. And as well, he emphasises the basic forms of the buildings and boats. So you recognise these by their basic forms. They're unembellished. He's concentrating on the forms. This work suggests the influence of the American painter James Abbott McNeill Whistler, whose aestheticism was in vogue at the time. Now, the aesthetic movement promoted the notion of art for art's sake. This means that for them, the main purpose of a painting was to be, first of all, a thing of beauty, a beautiful arrangement of colours and forms and pleasing to the eye. That was the first purpose of a painting. And only afterwards would they see it as being used as a vehicle for some external meaning, some extraneous meaning, such as maybe to illustrate a narrative or a story or record a likeness or something like that. But its first purpose was to be pleasing to the eye, a thing of beauty. The painting's high viewpoint and its wide areas of empty space, you can see here the sky and the water in the harbour, they suggest Japanese art, which was also influential among European artists at the time. Conder and Roberts shared a studio in Melbourne, and during the summer, along with another artist friend of theirs called Arthur Streeton, they travelled to the outdoor painting camps that were being established outside the city at this time. These were places where artists used to gather in the open air and paint the surrounding countryside. One of the most popular of these camps was the Eaglemont camp near the village of Heidelberg in the Melbourne suburbs. Apparently, Streeton had been given the use of an old semi-dilapidated farmhouse at Eaglemont, and the three moved out there to paint. And Conder produced a record of this that you can see here. It's called Impressionists Camp, and it shows Roberts and Streeton talking together in a room in the farmhouse with one of Streeton's paintings that was to become very famous later on, called Golden Summer Eaglemont, on the wall behind them, and you can see it there on the left of the picture. To all intents and purposes, Conder was very happy here, and he used to recall this time fondly in later life, in letters and elsewhere. Now, I just want to talk very briefly about the Australian art scene at this time, because I think it has some parallels with what was to happen in Ireland a little later on. Australia was a very new country at the end of the 19th century. For instance, only at this stage by now had more of its population been born there in Australia than had emigrated from somewhere else. And for the first time, people were becoming interested in the notion of having a separate, distinct nationality, and with forging a specifically Australian cultural identity for themselves. And artists were in a position to play an important part in this quest for a national identity. By painting specifically Australian subjects, they were able to provide a kind of visual frame of reference for the new country. They could capture the particular features of the Australian landscape along with a distinct way of life, which was Australian. They depicted the harshness and vastness of the terrain and incorporated as well scenes of logging and sheep shearing and camping out in the bush and other activities that they saw as specifically Australian. These works alluded to the tough, pioneering spirit of the settlers who went out and conquered the outback and made it their home. For example, this work by Conder, called Under a Southern Sun, which depicts a log splitting camp. And as you can see, it shows a bare, parched, sun-baked landscape with vast blue sky. And as well, it points to the harsh living conditions of the outback. You can see a tent with clothes hanging on a line hanging up against a tree and a child in the foreground, which suggests that it was a family who was living here. The Australian public responded to this because it reflected what they saw as their resilience and national character, as well as their cultural experience. And in the same way, in the early 20th century, Irish painters like Jack B. Yeats and Paul Henry, and Sean Keating as well, would travel out to the west of Ireland to record its landscape and people in an effort to present a visual frame of reference for a growing sense of Irish cultural identity. Conder and his companions were among the first Australian artists to paint the landscape in this way. And as a result, they became closely identified with a specifically Australian school of modern painting. Of course, now, I have to say, this national Australian art was very much of its time, and it only really reflected the viewpoint of one part of the Australian population, that is, the white, mostly British and Irish community of settlers. At this stage, at the end of the 19th century, artists didn't really consider the identity of other ethnic groups in Australia, such as other European and Asian immigrants, which were just starting to come in now, not to mention the continent's indigenous people. And it's only later on that artists began to explore this whole area. In 1889, the three artists mounted an exhibition in Melbourne, which they called the 9x5 Impression Exhibition. And the 9x5 was a reference to the size of the paintings, many of which were actually rough sketches done on the backs of wooden cigar boxes, which measured 9x5 inches. The exhibition showcased their particular plein air or open air style of painting, which would, in due course, become known as the Heidelberg School, after the village of Heidelberg, where they spent their summers painting. This also became known as Australian Impressionism. Now, the Heidelberg artists used Impressionist techniques, such as loose, swift, sketchy brushstrokes and brief, undefined, blobby forms. And they presented their outdoor sketches as finished works in the same way as the Impressionists did. However, they didn't, for example, take on the very important colour experiments that the Impressionists did. And their work was actually much closer in style to the naturalism of 19th century French landscape painters like Corot and Courbet. The Heidelberg painters were first and foremost interested in producing a real and recognisable impression of the local Australian landscape, and in capturing its atmosphere, its distinct colours and traits. It was distinctively and consciously Australian art. And an example is this sketch by Conder called On the River Yarra. It's an evocation of the local landscape. And you see he's used rough, rapid, expressive brushstrokes to try and swiftly capture the effect of light and local colour, specifically the red earth and dark greeny black eucalyptus trees that you see in the background. And you can also see the figures in the centre. They're barely distinguishable red and white blobs. This sketch was done very quickly out of doors, and Conder's fingerprints are actually visible on it. And it's a very good example of the work that was being shown in the 9x5 Impression exhibition. So Conder made a success of his early career as a painter in Australia. So much so that his uncle offered to finance a 2-year stay in Paris to enable him to study there. Accordingly, in 1890, after just 6 years in the country, Conder left Australia for Europe. And as it turned out, he never returned. Despite this, he's remembered there, to the extent that a suburb of Canberra is named Conder after him. When Conder arrived in Paris, he enrolled in the Académie Julian and then at the studio of the very well-known artist Fernand Cormont, where a lot of artists gathered. Here he came into contact with many very well-known painters, such as Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. And he also became close friends with the Englishman William Rothenstein, with whom he shared a studio. Rothenstein went on to become a very successful painter in London, and you can see one of his paintings in the Hugh Lane Legacy exhibition that's on at the moment. He was also a staunch supporter of Conder and his work. And the two were to have a critically successful joint exhibition in 1892 at a gallery on the Boulevard des Malherbe in Paris. It was visited by leading Impressionist painters, including Degas and Camille Pissarro, who praised the work on view. This was a high point of Conder's early years in Paris. Now, while officially he was studying at the Académie Julian, Conder, like so many of his fellow artists, was more interested in receiving his education informally in Paris's cafes and nightclubs. He was fascinated by Parisian nightlife and was a regular habitué of the cafes and nightclubs around Montmartre. He depicted this in his paintings, such as this one, called Le Moulin Rouge. It shows two women performing a quadrille dance before a large crowd of onlookers in front of the nightclub. And later on, they will be able to go into the nightclub and see the same quadrille dance performed on stage. Conder embraced the bohemian life of the city and quickly earned a reputation as a dandy and man about town. He became friendly with cosmopolitan figures like Oscar Wilde and Aubrey Beardsley, who were based in Paris at the time, and he moved in their circles. He took to drinking absinthe and in time became a heavy drinker. And he also experimented with smoking hashish. In fact, Conder became so well known as a connoisseur of Parisian nightlife that Toulouse-Lautrec used him as a model for several of his works portraying Parisian beau monde revelers. For example, these two. The one on the left, which is a program for a play called Le Missionnaire, depicts his head in profile in a box at the theatre, and you can see it there at the top, just beside the curtain. While the drawing at the left shows him out dining in a restaurant with a female companion. Now, in Australia, Conder's influences had been mostly confined to the Impressionism, French naturalism, and aestheticism that had reached there by the 1890s. However, when he moved to Paris, his artistic influences expanded, and he came into contact with many new ideas, such as post-impressionism, symbolism, and Art Nouveau. And as a result of these new influences, his painting style began to change. He sometimes travelled abroad at this time for inspiration, including to Algiers, and he produced work like this one, called the Hot Sands Mustafa. It's a study in colour and light, and as you can see, the effect of hard sunlight on stone and the contrasting deep blue sea in the background. He also went out into the French countryside to make studies of the landscape. Apparently, he had seen Monet's series of paintings of haystacks done under different atmospheric conditions, and he wanted to see if he could do something similar. By the mid-1890s, Conder became interested in decorative design, and his painting style changed again. This period in the mid-1890s saw a rise in demand for interior decoration schemes, or what some people called totally designed environments. And the skills of fine art painters were called into play in producing them. As a result, many highly regarded artists, such as Whistler, were being employed to decorate rooms in patrons' houses. Conder responded to this new taste and expanded his repertoire to include applied arts, such as illustrations and paintings on silk, and most successfully for him, designs for fans. Conder's fan designs were hugely popular and enhanced his reputation in both Paris and London. Conder wasn't the only artist to design fans at this time. In fact, the fan became quite an important art form and was used by painters like Degas and Vincent van Gogh, for example. However, while these artists were influenced by Japanese fans, Conder was more inspired by the work of 18th century Rococo artists like Watteau and Fragonard, and he illustrated his fans using imagery derived from that period, aristocratic 18th century imagery. The Hugh Lane Gallery has one of these fan designs, which you can see here. It's called the Grey Fan, and it's watercolour painted on silk. Now, I don't know if you can see the design, or if you can make the design out, but it's a series of finely drawn vignettes of outdoor scenes, distinct vignettes of outdoor scenes. And they're elegant groups with ladies in crinolines on a background of drapery and clouds and classical motifs. It's done in pale monochrome tones and suggests a refined, idyllic, aristocratic 18th century atmosphere. It's a really decorative piece. It's framed and intended to be hung on a drawing room wall like a painting. Conder also did drawings, including a very highly regarded collection of lithographs illustrating the work of Balzac. And here's an example from the Hugh Lane collection depicting a dramatic scene from Balzac's story La Peau de Chagrin, or as it's known in English, The Magic Skin. As well as fan designs and illustrations, Conder also painted silk panels, which were intended to be hung in rooms as part of an interior decoration arrangement. Now, Conder's silk panels were very popular with people seeking the totally designed rooms that had come into vogue. And as a result, he gained a reputation as an interior decorator. And he received commissions to design interiors for smart London houses. And he even designed theatrical costumes and evening dresses for women. So he had a reputation as a designer. Here's an example of one of his panels. It's called L'Oiseau Bleu, or the Bluebird, And as you can see, it's an elegant, romantic fantasy with golden yellow and red colour tones and striking splashes of blue in the bluebird, and particularly the blue coat of the gentleman in the centre, right at the centre of the picture. You could call Conder's work at this time a type of Rococo, of neo-Rococo, delicate, decorative watercolour-like paintings of ladies in crinolines wandering through summer landscapes. A sort of aristocratic country idyll or fantasy. I think that this work from the period, called The Green Apple, is a good example of his work at that time. It's delicately painted in muted tones, and it has a hazy, elegant, harmonious atmosphere, suggesting sunny days in refined country retreats. It's actually an oil painting, but it's very thinly and liquidly painting, so it has the appearance of a watercolour, which suited the tone that Conder was trying to give. Now, Conder moved back to London along with William Rothenstein in 1894 and joined the New English Arts Club, which was set up as a modern alternative to the Royal Academy for exhibitions. And he exhibited his work regularly there. So he was seen at the time as a modern artist. From then on, he moved back and forth from London to France, working between the two locations. He continued to enjoy Parisian nightlife. He was generally short of money, and he became increasingly addicted to alcohol. In 1900, he married a wealthy Canadian widow called Stella Mars Belford and appeared to settle down a bit. In any event, his money troubles were over by marrying her. Now, she had excellent social contacts and so was able to provide him with an entree into Edwardian high society. And there he was able to gain new clients, and he did gain new clients. Around this time, Hugh Lane began to collect Conder's work, and he was probably encouraged to do this by William Orpen. Now, Conder and Orpen had met in Paris, and the two became very good friends. In fact, Conder painted the portrait of Orpen that's now hanging in the National Gallery in Dublin. Lane included works by Conder in the collection that he was putting together to give to the Municipal Gallery. And in 1905, Conder presented him with a pastel called The Bather. And this is in the National Gallery, and this is in the gallery's collection as well. Now, this brings us to the work that we're looking at today, A Stormy Day Brighton. Conder and his wife paid a visit to Brighton late in 1904 during very bad weather and stayed in a hotel on the seafront. While they were there, he painted several works from his bedroom window looking out over the promenade and pier. And this is one of them. And it's interesting, he used the same, he painted from an upstairs window out over the view, just the same as he did all those years ago in Sydney when he painted Departure of the Orient. Now, we know the scene is of Brighton because it's written at the bottom of the canvas. But apart from the pier, there's nothing to specifically identify its location. And you get the impression that rather than a particular place, Conder was interested in evoking the atmosphere of wet, stormy weather on a dull winter's day. The dominant theme is a swirling rough sea with its large crashing waves and the leaden sky above it. The railed promenade at the bottom of the canvas underlines the scene, and the vertical figures and the pole at the end of the pier offset the horizontal elements of pavement, sea and sky that you can see working way up the canvas. Also, the pier on the right and the small indistinct figures on the left serve as the devices to draw attention to what Conder is interested in, which is raw nature and the weather. The end of the pier is almost disappearing under the powerful waves crashing over it. And the reflections of the figures in the water on the pavement draw attention to its wetness, suggesting that the sea is so rough that it's breaking over the wall and onto the promenade. These emphasize the stormy atmosphere that Conder's focused on. It's painted in a muted colour scheme of greens and greys and pale browns and white, which is in thick impasto to emphasise the breaking waves. At the same time, there are some brighter flecks of blue dotted about in the sea and the sky, suggesting sunlight being reflected through the clouds here and there. And these have the effect of lightening the overall tone and adding contrast. Between 1904 and 1905, Conder produced at least 5 oil paintings of Brighton, all showing a similar scene of the seafront and pier, and all from a similar high viewpoint, in different weather conditions, sun, wind, rain, etc. As I've said, this particular one concentrates on the effects of stormy weather. And here are 3 other ones. They're all of roughly the same place, though from different angles, and with differing amounts of identifying details. For example, the building in the painting on the right and the headland on the one below. They all seem to be trying to evoke different types of weather and times of year. Wind, rain, springtime, winter. You can see the one on the left is actually called Spring Brighton. I wonder if Conder was remembering his early interest in Monet. He might have been trying to emulate Monet's various series of paintings, where he explored the effects of different seasons, times of day, and weather on a particular motif, such as haystacks or poplar trees. Conder was also probably influenced by similar works by Whistler, such as this one, called The Shore at Pourville. Like Conder's Stormy Day, this is Whistler's aesthetic response to the sea. It's a study in pale, muted colour harmonies, and it also seeks to evoke an atmosphere rather than accurately portray a specific place. And like Stormy Day, it's not interested in giving a detailed record of a particular place. Now, Stormy Day Brighton is quite different to Conder's elegant decorative work of the same period. If anything, it resembles his much earlier impressionistic Australian paintings. In fact, he may have been trying to develop a new style, closer to the modernist ideas that were starting to dominate art. That's to re-present himself as a more modern artist or avant-garde artist. Because by this time, the early 20th century, Conder's elegant 18th century style works were increasingly out of step with the more avant-garde art of younger painters such as Augustus John and even William Rothenstein. Rather than Conder's escapist fantasies, they were more interested in depicting ordinary, everyday life and the experiences of real people. Now, unfortunately, Conder's efforts to change his art style weren't successful. He had several large exhibitions in 1905 and 1906, which included some of the Brighton paintings. And the reaction of several of the critics was that he shouldn't try to respond to what he thought the public were now looking for in art, but instead he should pursue his own particular personal style. In other words, they preferred his fans and silk panels. Now, by this time, Conder's health was beginning to fail. He was actually suffering from advanced syphilis, which he had been first diagnosed with as a very young man in Australia before he was 20. His heavy drinking was also taking its toll, and in 1906 he had a stroke. Now, he went to Cornwall to recover, and while there, he painted what was to be one of his last paintings. This one on the left, called The Sands at Nuki. It's another beach scene, and it reflects his interest in evoking the mood of a sunny summer's day. It uses the same compositional devices deployed for his early beach scenes in Sydney. The large-scale view, broad sweep of land and sea, small sketchy figures, and a high vantage point. And in this way, it recalls faint echoes of his happy early Australian beach paintings, such as Bronte Beach that I showed you earlier, and again, I'm showing you here down on the right. For that reason, I think that The Sands at Nuki is quite a poignant work. He's harking back at the end of his life to the start of his career. By the end of 1906, Conder became paralysed. He was eventually confined to a sanatorium where he died at the beginning of 1909. Conder's reputation as a painter remained high in Edwardian Britain. However, after the end of the First World War, his decorative fans and silk panels seemed completely irrelevant and frivolous to a society that had experienced the rigors of war and wanted to forget the old order and forge something new. And it's only in the 1960s that he experienced a revival in Australia in recognition of his contribution to modern art there. And you'll find the majority of his works in Australian galleries. So there you have the story of Charles Conder, and what I think is a very fine and atmospheric evocation of a stormy winter's day in a seaside town. I think that the best way to enjoy a painting is to look at it in person. And this painting's on show in the gallery, and I hope you'll come and see what you think of it yourself when you visit. Thank you very much, and goodbye.